If you look back at the wild history of professional wrestling, you'll notice that certain groups don't just participate in the show, they completely define the era. I mean, think about the legendary impact of the Four Horsemen, the absolute cultural takeover of the NWO, the dominance of Evolution, or the chaotic arrival of the Shield. These weren't just teams you watched on TV, they were literally industry shifting forces. Today, we're diving into a fascinating breakdown of the two massive factions currently defining the modern landscape, dominating television, and of course, polarizing fans. There's this powerful, undeniable truth in this industry. In professional wrestling, every generation gets its defining faction. And right now, the landscape is completely dominated by two massive opposing groups sitting at the absolute center of the two biggest promotions in the world, WWE and AEW. Both have totally changed the trajectory of their respective companies, both became the focal points of television, and both have inspired incredibly passionate fans and, some pretty harsh critics too. And honestly, that brings us right to the central conflict of today's explainer. On one side, we have WWE's Bloodline, a highly produced, emotional dynasty built entirely on family, absolute power, and domination. On the completely opposite side, we have AEW's Death Riders, this gritty, violent collective driven not by bloodlines, but by an uncompromising ideology and a raw combat aesthetic. Today, we're stripping away the merchandise sales and television ratings to truly analyze these two juggernauts. To start, let's look at origins, the family saga versus violent ideology. We really need to understand how these groups began, because as you'll see, their foundations are complete opposites. Okay, so the Bloodline wasn't actually supposed to become one of the greatest stories in modern wrestling. It started with a huge problem. For years, Roman Reigns was WWE's chosen hero, but fans actively, actually scratched that, viscerally rejected him. But that all changed in 2020. Roman came back, not as a hero, but as this cold, manipulative character, the tribal chief. He was soon joined by his real-life cousins Jimmy and Jey Uso, and later Solo Sikoa. But the real game changer? The integration of Sami Zayn. Here was a guy who wasn't family, but desperately wanted to belong. That dynamic turned the whole thing into a captivating, deeply emotional family drama. Now contrast that directly with AEW's Death Riders. While WWE was meticulously crafting this family saga, the Death Riders had zero family hierarchy. Instead, they're united by a shared philosophy of authentic brutality. They literally view wrestling as struggle and pain. They actively reject the catchy slogans and social media comfort, valuing pure grit over glamour. It's an ideology that says respect in wrestling must be earned, not given, which makes the entire group feel incredibly dangerous and completely unpredictable. That foundational difference naturally leads into our next section, Kings versus War Generals. Let's shift gears and look at the drastically different leadership styles dictating these factions. Look at these stark contrasts in how these guys handle power. Both methods work, but they couldn't be more different. Roman Reigns, he demands absolute loyalty. He leads through strict control, sitting high on his throne, and punishes failure severely. Jon Moxley, on the other hand, leads straight from the battlefield. He isn't sitting above his guys. He fights, suffers, and literally bleeds right alongside his allies in the trenches. Let's dive a little deeper into the psychology of Reigns' authoritarian control. The whole tribal chief thing isn't just a fun nickname. It defines a structural reality. He functions exactly like a king ruling his kingdom. Every single decision, every championship pursued, the status of every family member, it all revolves entirely around him. It is a masterclass in emotional manipulation, demanding that the entire world acknowledge him, from his subjects in the ring right up to the fans in the arena. Then, in stark contrast, you have the War General. The Death Riders don't follow Jon Moxley because they're terrified he's going to punish them. They follow him because they deeply, genuinely believe in his chaotic, uncompromising vision of what professional wrestling should be. Moxley, A guy who seems to genuinely enjoy bleeding on live television represents the darkest side of AEW. He inspires a shared vision of authenticity, creating this collective that feels like they could jump the rail and attack anyone at any given moment, driven strictly by fighting spirit. Which brings us to storytelling versus atmosphere. Here's how each faction actually hooks their audience using entirely different narrative tools. For the Bloodline, their absolute bread and butter is long-term character development. This is essentially a high-stakes family drama brilliantly disguised as a wrestling storyline. It wasn't just about who won the match on Sunday. It was about loyalty tests, massive power struggles, and heartbreaking betrayals. The emotional peaks were insane, like Sami Zayn finally earning the family's acceptance, only to later make the agonizing choice to strike Roman with a steel chair to protect a friend. That created a level of emotional investment that totally transcended typical sports entertainment. This quote right here hits the nail on the head. The greatest moments weren't matches, they were conversations. Think about why this is so crucial for the viewer. WWE successfully conditioned millions of fans to hang on to every single spoken word. They made us emotionally invested in subtle glances, backstage manipulations, sudden betrayals, and even just hugs in the middle of the ring. That is what made the faction must-see television for years. Meanwhile, the Death Riders, they took a completely atmospheric approach. They entirely bypassed those traditional soap opera tropes. Their goal wasn't to tell a long, dramatic story with backstage crying segments. It was to make a definitive statement about fighting spirit. They established a culture of pure intensity and identity, putting raw violence and absolute conviction way ahead of traditional entertainment value. So, what does this all mean? It really boils down to this. The Bloodline invited audiences into its world. They built relationships designed to make fans actually cry and feel deep empathy. The Death Riders, however, challenged audiences to survive in theirs. They used violence and intensity to intentionally make fans uncomfortable, constantly pushing the boundaries. Both approaches were massive successes, just executed in wildly different ways. But of course, no faction escapes the critics, not even the defining ones of a generation. Let's pivot to the criticisms, looking objectively at the flaws both storylines faced from their own passionate fan bases. Look, neither approach was flawless, right? For the Bloodline, the primary complaint was just fatigue. People felt the story stretched on way too long, relying heavily on repetitive themes like outside interference and the same family conflict week after week. A lot of fans wished WWE had just pulled the trigger and ended the story at its absolute peak. On the flip side, the Death Riders took heat for lacking emotional investment. Because they leaned so heavily into authentic violence and atmosphere, some fans felt they were more of a concept than a complete narrative, leaving viewers wanting some deeper, actual character development. Let's wrap this up with the ultimate impact. What do these rival philosophies actually prove about the modern sports entertainment industry? You see, these factions were never really direct competitors. They're reflections of two wildly different visions. The Bloodline achieved standalone narrative success. They mastered unmatched storytelling and created genuine emotional investment that people are going to be talking about for decades. The Death Riders, conversely, perfected their own supreme domain, raw philosophy. They perfectly embodied the unpolished, uncompromising, and violent spirit of AEW. So why does this matter to you as a viewer? Because these contrasting visions prove a fundamental truth about the industry today. Faction warfare is, without a doubt, still one of the most incredibly powerful storytelling tools in wrestling. Whether you as a fan crave a deeply produced, emotionally manipulative family drama or a violent, gritty ideology fought out on the mat, factions remain the ultimate vehicle to deliver exactly what we want to see. Well, we've explored the family dynasty ruled by a king and the violent collective led by a war general. We've seen how they tell their stories, and we've analyzed where they fell short. But now, it's totally up to you. Weigh the evidence we've talked about today between the unmatched emotion of the family saga and the raw intensity of the battlefield ideology. Which faction do you think truly leaves the greater mark on the industry? The Bloodline or the Death Riders?